They cleared buildings in Fallujah and detected explosives in Kandahar. But when 14 military working dogs finished their tours, the system treated them like broken, used equipment. Meet Ava Carter, a 22-year-old Navy SEAL who refused to leave these four-legged veterans behind. Watch how she bravely takes on military bureaucracy to save a grieving German shepherd named Titan and 13 other forgotten heroes from the auction block.
She walked down the row of kennels and didn't say a word, just looked. Cage by cage, dog by dog. 14 German shepherds who had once cleared buildings in Fallujah, detected IEDs in Kandahar, and dragged wounded soldiers out of places that don't appear on any public map, now sitting behind steel bars in a government facility in Colorado, waiting to be sold to the highest bidder, like used equipment. She stopped at the end of the row, turned to the room full of officers and buyers and administrators, and said 4 words that made everyone go completely silent. "I'll take every one." Nobody laughed yet. That came 30 seconds later. Drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story travels. Subscribe if you haven't yet, and stay with me all the way to the end, because what this 22-year-old Navy SEAL does next is something the United States military did not see coming. The facility was called the Rocky Mountain Military Working Dog Transition Center, which was a long name for a place that did a simple and mostly unexamined thing. It took dogs who were no longer operationally useful to the United States military and processed them into civilian life. Processed was the operative word. Ava Carter had been hearing that word for 6 months, ever since she first started making calls. She had heard it from administrative officers in 3 different states, from a contracting coordinator at a base in Virginia who had been genuinely pleasant and genuinely unhelpful, and from a colonel who had told her, with the patient tone of a man explaining something to someone he considered well-meaning but naive, that the dogs were fine, that the system worked, and that her concerns, while admirable, were not supported by the evidence. She had written down everything he said. She had noted the date and the time, and his rank and his name. And then she had driven to Colorado to see for herself. She was 22 years old, long dark brown hair pulled back the way she always wore it in the field, olive green fitted t-shirt, military camouflage cargo pants, the kind of physical composure that comes not from size, she was 5'4" and lean, but from years of training that had made stillness her default mode. She had been a Navy SEAL for 14 months, which was long enough to have earned the respect of people who did not give it easily, and short enough that some of them still occasionally made the mistake of underestimating her. Beside her, on a loose lead, walked Ranger. The German shepherd was 4 years old, with the tan gold and black coat of his breed and the specific, alert bearing of a dog who had spent his working life in environments where inattention had consequences. He was trained for explosive detection and patrol work, had been on 2 deployments, and had the kind of calm that animals develop when they have processed enough genuine danger to stop being startled by manufactured tension. He knew something was wrong the moment they walked through the door. Ava knew it the moment she heard the sound. Not barking. That was what she had expected. What she got instead was something that hit her in a place no tactical training had prepared for. Whining. Low, continuous. The sound of animals who had learned that loud protest produced no results and had shifted into something smaller and more resigned. The particular sound of creatures who had given up on being heard. She walked the first row slowly, Ranger at her knee. The dogs reacted to her differently than they had reacted to the handlers who had brought her in. They came to the front of the kennels, pressed their noses through the bars. A few of them made sounds that were specific and directed, not the general anxiety whine she had been hearing since the door opened, but something more targeted. Something that said, "You are different from the others. We know what you are." They could smell it. The same compounds, the same stress hormones from the same kinds of places. Combat. Fear that had been processed and kept working. The particular biochemistry of a soldier. Ranger moved kennel to kennel beside her, touching noses through the bars with each dog he passed, doing some kind of quiet reconnaissance that Ava trusted completely, because she had learned that his read on situations was rarely wrong and never dishonest. Captain Jerome Doyle had been the facility commander for 3 years. He was a practical man who ran a practical operation and had developed a philosophical acceptance of the gap between the ideal treatment of military working dogs and the operational reality of what a government facility with a fixed budget could provide. He walked beside Ava with the specific quality of an officer who was cooperating with an inspection, while not believing that the inspection was going to produce anything that required him to change anything. "How many dogs currently in transition?" Ava asked without looking at him. 14 active, 3 more incoming next month. "What's the average time in facility before placement?" 4 to 6 months. "And placement means civilian adoption?" "Primarily. Some go to law enforcement, some to certified training programs." He paused. "The process is very thorough." "What's the failure to place rate?" A half-second pause. Small, but she caught it. "Some dogs don't adapt well to civilian environments." "What happens to those dogs?" Another pause, longer this time. "They're handled humanely." Ava stopped walking. "That's not an answer, Captain." He looked at her. She was 22, and she was holding his gaze with the flat, patient attention of someone who was going to stay on this sentence until it became a real answer. "Some are euthanized," he said, "when behavioral issues make them unsafe for placement." Ava turned back to the kennels. She kept her face neutral. She was very good at keeping her face neutral. She had learned it in the same place she had learned most things, by needing it. She stopped at kennel 11. The dog inside was a male German Shepherd, maybe 6 years old, larger than most of the others, and thinner than he should have been. He was sitting at the back of the kennel, with his eyes on the floor and his ears slightly back. Not the posture of an aggressive dog, not the posture of a fearful one in the conventional sense. The posture of something else. The posture of an animal that had decided it was no longer worth the energy to orient toward things that kept not being what he needed them to be. The name card on the kennel read, Titan, MWD 7714. Explosive detection. 47 confirmed fines. Retired 14 months ago. 47 confirmed fines. Ava knew what that meant. Each one of those numbers was an IED that didn't kill anyone. Each one of those numbers was soldiers who drove home instead of being shipped home in boxes. 47 times, this dog had been the reason someone's family got a phone call instead of a knock on the door. Retired 14 months ago. In this facility. Waiting. "What happened to his handler?" Ava asked. Doyle checked his clipboard. "Handler was KIA in 2021. Helmand Province." Ava stood very still. Ranger, who had been moving steadily down the row, came back to her. He stood beside her and looked at Titan's kennel, and went completely still. His body pressed gently against her left leg. Titan raised his head, looked at Ranger, then at Ava. For the first time since she had entered the building, the big dog stood up. Slowly, with the careful movement of an animal that had been spending a lot of time sitting down. He walked to the front of the kennel and pressed his nose through the bars and stayed there. Ava put her fingers through the bars and let him smell her hand. He didn't pull back. His behavioral assessment notes flagged him as non-responsive and potentially depressed, Doyle said from behind her. Not a good placement candidate. He just responded to me, Ava said. You're military personnel. The dogs often... He responded to me because he's not broken, Ava said. He's grieving. She kept her voice level. There's a difference, and I need you to understand that I'm aware of the difference. Doyle said nothing. She moved away from Titan's kennel and continued down the row. She stopped at 2 more dogs whose files she had memorized. A Belgian Malinois named Ghost, with a record of 4 years in combat tracking, currently labeled aggressive. A German Shepherd named Delta, who had been a patrol dog in Ramadi, and whose record showed she had not eaten a full meal in 11 days. Not aggressive, not broken, grieving, and without context. She knew the feeling. She knew it from soldiers, from teammates, from the specific way humans looked when they had lost the person beside them and hadn't been given any structure through which to process it. The dogs were doing what people did when there was no outlet and no explanation and no one who understood the language of what they had been through. They were shutting down. By the time she reached the end of the second row, she had seen all 14 dogs. She had the files on 12 of them memorized. She had been making calls for 6 months and writing emails for 8 months before that. And she had a folder on her phone with 12 months of documented correspondence, donor commitments, legal consultations, and architectural plans that she had been building quietly and methodically while doing her actual job at the same time, because that was how she operated. You built the thing while everyone assumed you were just talking. She stopped at the end of the row. She turned to the room. Doyle, 2 junior officers, a civilian representative from the contracting office, and 3 pre-registered civilian buyers who had come for the afternoon auction. She said, "I'll take every retired canine here." The room processed this for approximately 3 seconds. Then one of the civilian buyers laughed. Not unkindly, genuinely, the way a person laughs when they hear something that seems to belong to a different category of statement than the ones being made around it. Doyle looked at her with the expression of a man reassessing a situation he had been confident about. "Petty Officer Carter, I understand the sentiment, but 14 military working dogs represents a significant financial and logistical commitment," Ava said. "I know. I've been calculating it for a year." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not speaking sentimentally, Captain. I'm stating an intention." A pause. "I have the documentation if you want to see it." The room went quiet again. Ranger sat down at her left side. His eyes moved across the facility with the patient, comprehensive attention of an animal that had spent years being the most alert thing in any room. One of the buyers cleared his throat. "You're serious?" "I'm always serious," Ava said. She reached into the cargo pocket of her pants and came out with a folded set of documents. Nobody moved, and in Kennel 11, Titan pressed his nose harder against the bars, watching the young woman in the olive green t-shirt hold a stack of papers that nobody in this room had expected, and that were about to change everything for 14 dogs who had stopped expecting anything. Ranger looked back at him. His tail moved once. And the morning, which had started as a routine facility inspection and an auction that everyone present understood how it would end, became something that none of them had a script for. The documents were real. That was the first thing Captain Doyle established, because it was the first thing he needed to know. He took the folder from Ava's hands with a careful expression of a man who was hoping to find a reason to hand it back quickly, and spent 4 minutes reading while the room stayed in the specific, suspended quiet of people who have been surprised and are waiting to find out what kind of surprise it is. He read the first page, then the second. His expression shifted in a way he clearly didn't intend to be visible. "This is a non-profit filing," he said. "Registered in Montana. Approved 8 months ago." Ava kept her voice even. "Page 4 has the land deed. Page 7 has the veterinary partnership agreements. Pages 9 through 14 are the donor commitments with current balances. He turned to page 4. One of the civilian buyers, the one who had laughed, leaned toward his companion and said something in a low voice. Ava didn't look at him. She was watching Doyle read, reading him the way she read everything. Not for what was on the surface, but for what the surface was trying not to show. What she saw was a man recalibrating. He had come into this morning with a framework: routine inspection, routine auction, routine outcome. He was now holding documents that did not fit that framework, and the recalibration was happening in real time, and he wasn't entirely sure where it was going to land. "The funding," he said slowly. "Where did it come from?" "Veterans, former handlers, a foundation in Virginia that works with service animal organizations. 3 private donors who have family members with PTSD who have been helped by therapy dogs." She paused. "And 18 months of my own salary." Silence. One of the junior officers looked up. He was maybe 25, and he had the expression of someone who had just heard something that recategorized the person standing in front of him. "Your own—" "It's my money," Ava said simply. "I can spend it how I choose." Doyle looked up from the documents. He studied her with the measured attention of a senior officer looking at a junior one, and trying to determine whether what he was dealing with was idealism that hadn't met reality yet, or something more structural. "Petty Officer Carter," he said. 14 military working dogs. The cost of care alone. I have the projections, page 11. He turned to page 11. The numbers were thorough, and they were not optimistic. They were realistic, built by a veterinarian who specialized in working dogs, a behavioral specialist who had spent 15 years working with trauma-affected animals, and a former military logistics officer who had helped Ava build the operational framework over 9 months of evenings and weekends. The projections included food, veterinary care, behavioral rehabilitation, facility maintenance, staffing, and a contingency fund for the dogs who would require the most intensive intervention. Doyle read every number. Then he looked up at her. "You've been planning this for how long?" 14 months, Ava said. "Since the last deployment." Something moved in his expression. Not softening. He wasn't that kind of officer. More like the shift that happens when you have been arguing against something, and the argument is taken out of your hands by facts that are more organized than your objection. "Captain," the civilian contracting representative, a man named Griggs, who had been standing to the side with the expression of someone who processed paperwork for a living and was now watching paperwork become something more than paperwork. "The facility protocol for alternative placement arrangements requires a formal review period before—" "How long?" Ava asked. Griggs blinked. "I'm sorry?" "The review period. How long does it take?" "Standard is 30 days. "These dogs have been here an average of 11 months, Ava said. She kept her voice completely level. The kind of level that isn't suppressing anger. It's channeling it into precision. "One of them has been here 14 months. His handler died in Afghanistan. He hasn't eaten a full meal in 3 weeks, according to his own facility records." She looked at Griggs with the calm, absolute attention of someone who had spent years in environments where the gap between paperwork and reality could get people killed. "How long does the review period take when a dog is in medical decline?" Griggs opened his mouth, closed it. "There's an expedited process," Doyle said quietly, "for welfare-related concerns." "I know," Ava said. "Page 3 of my documentation references it. Section 7B of the MWD Transition Protocol." Another silence. Ranger had been moving quietly along the kennel row for the last several minutes, doing the thing he always did in new environments, building a complete picture of everything in it. He returned to Ava's side now and sat. He looked at Doyle with a patient, evaluating attention that large working dogs have when they have decided to pay attention to something. Doyle looked at the dog, then at Ava, then back at the documentation. "Walk me through the facility," he said. Not an approval, not a rejection. The sentence of a man buying time to think while appearing to move forward. "I'd rather walk you through the dogs," Ava said. He stared at her for a moment. Then he said, "All right." They started at Kennel 1, a 5-year-old German Shepherd named Duke, retired from patrol work after a training injury to his left rear leg that had healed improperly. His behavioral file described him as unpredictable and prone to resource guarding. Ava crouched in front of the kennel. "Duke!" The dog looked up. "He's flagged aggressive," the junior officer said from behind her. "He's been in a steel box for 9 months, Ava said. "What would you be?" She kept her voice quiet and her posture completely non-threatening. "Duke, come here." Duke stood, walked to the front of the kennel with a slight hitch in his left rear step that confirmed the improperly healed injury. He pressed his nose through the bars. Ranger touched his nose gently. Something in Duke's posture changed. His shoulders dropped. His ears moved from back to neutral. "Unpredictable," Doyle said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite certainty anymore. "Responsive," Ava said, "to someone who knows what they're looking for." They moved to Kennel 4. Ghost, the Belgian Malinois, tagged as aggressive. Ghost paced, 3 steps forward, 3 steps back. The obsessive, repetitive movement of an animal whose nervous system had been running at operational pitch for years and had never been given a proper down-regulation protocol. "How much exercise does he get per day?" Ava asked. 30 minutes, twice daily," one of the handlers said. "He was running 12 miles a day in the field." She looked at the handler. "He's not aggressive. He's understimulated. His nervous system doesn't know it's not at war anymore, because nobody has taught it that." She stood. "That's a training issue, a rehabilitation issue. It's completely addressable." The handler looked at Doyle. Doyle said nothing. They reached Kennel 11. Titan hadn't moved from the front of the kennel since Ava had left him earlier. He was still standing, still watching, as if he had decided that this time he would wait and see, rather than return to the back of the cage where nothing ever changed. Doyle stopped beside Ava and looked at the file card. 47 fines. Handler KIA. 14 months. His integration attempts failed, Doyle said. It came out slightly different from the way he had been talking before. Less administrative. "We placed him with a retired officer 18 months ago. He returned him after 6 days. Said the dog would wake up in the middle of the night and stand in doorways like he was waiting for someone." The room was very quiet. "He was waiting for someone," Ava said. "He was waiting for Sergeant Marcus Webb." She had memorized the handler file. She always memorized the handler file. Webb was 28 years old. He had a daughter named Claire. He and Titan served together for 3 years. She looked at the dog, not at Doyle. "Titan doesn't understand that Webb is gone. He understands that Webb didn't come back, and no one has explained it to him in a language that makes any sense. So he stands in doorways at night, looking for the person who was supposed to come back." She paused. "Titan doesn't have a behavioral problem. He has a grief problem." Nobody spoke for a long moment. The civilian buyer who had laughed earlier was not laughing now. He was standing with his hands in his pockets, looking at Titan with an expression that had traveled a significant distance from where it had started when he walked in that morning. "What are you going to do about that?" Doyle asked. And this time the question was genuine. Not bureaucratic, not skeptical. He actually wanted to know. "There's a grief specialist in Montana who works with trauma-affected working dogs. She's already committed to the program. Ava reached through the bars again. Titan pressed his nose into her palm. And we're going to reach out to Webb's family. His daughter Claire is 17 now. The research on handler grief in military dogs shows that familiar scent from family members can help significantly with reorientation. She paused. Nobody called Webb's family when Titan was retired. Nobody told them the dog was still alive. Doyle went completely still. Standard protocol doesn't require. I know what standard protocol requires, Ava said. She finally looked at him. I'm telling you what basic human decency requires. A pause. And what basic dog decency requires. The silence this time had a different quality. The kind of silence that lands when someone has said the truest thing in a room, and the room doesn't have an immediate counter to it. The junior officer, the young one, maybe 25, cleared his throat. His name tag read Kowalski. Petty Officer Carter, can I ask you something directly? Go ahead. Why you? You're 22 years old. You're active duty. You have a career. You have. This is going to take years of your life. Why not a foundation? Why not an advocacy organization? Why you, personally? Ava looked at him. She looked at him with the steady, unhurried attention she gave everything that deserved a real answer. Because I know what it's like to do something for someone, and then have the system decide that the exchange is complete, she said. These dogs went where they were sent. They did everything they were asked to do. They found the bombs. They protected the soldiers. They worked until their bodies or their minds couldn't keep working at that pitch anymore. And then they were retired to a facility in Colorado and processed. She kept Kowalski's gaze. I'm in the Navy. I know that the system is not designed to be cruel. I know that the people who built these protocols were trying to create something functional. But functional and right are not always the same thing. And when they're not the same thing, someone has to say so. She looked back at Titan. I'm saying so. Kowalski nodded slowly. He looked at the dog. He looked at the documents. Something moved across his face that was personal and brief, and then managed. I did 2 years in Kandahar, he said quietly. We had a dog on our unit. Bo. Belgian Malinois. He found 3 IEDs in 1 week. He stopped. I don't know what happened to Bo. What year? Ava asked. 2019. She looked at him for a moment. Give me your contact information before you leave today. He stared at her. Why? Because I've been building a database of MWD service records cross-referenced with retirement outcomes. If Bo is still in the system, I'll find him. She held his gaze. If he's not, you'll at least know. Kowalski looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached into his pocket for a card. Doyle had been watching this exchange. When it finished, he looked at the documents in his hand, and then at the facility around him. The kennels, the dogs, the specific and irreducible reality of 14 animals in steel boxes who had done things that most people who made decisions about them would never be asked to do. He looked at Ava. The expedited welfare review, he said. I can initiate it this afternoon. Something in Ava's posture shifted, not visible as relief, but as the particular settling of someone whose body has been holding tension on behalf of a plan for long enough that the first movement toward resolution registers physically. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me yet, Doyle said. The review board has the final authority. I can initiate it. I can't guarantee the outcome. I know, she said. That's what the documentation is for. She looked back at Titan. The dog was still watching her, still standing at the front of his kennel, nose through the bars, with the patient, sustained attention of an animal that had decided this time was different, but had not yet allowed himself to fully believe it. Ranger walked over and sat beside the kennel. He didn't look at Ava. He didn't look at Doyle. He looked at Titan with the specific, steady communication of one working dog to another. A thing that required no translation and admitted no ambiguity. Whatever passed between them in that moment belonged to them. But every person in that room who watched it felt it. And the auction that had been scheduled for 2 o'clock that afternoon, the one that had been on Doyle's calendar for 3 weeks, the one the civilian buyers had driven from 2 states away to attend, was quietly, without fanfare, postponed. Pending review, which was the only 2 words in Ava Carter's experience that had ever been worth waiting for. The review board met 11 days later. Ava had known it would not be a formality. She had known it from the moment Doyle said pending review, with the specific inflection of a man who was giving her something while simultaneously warning her that the something could be taken back. She had spent 11 days preparing for a room that was going to be looking for reasons to say no, because that was the nature of institutional review boards. They were built to protect the institution, not to champion the thing being reviewed. She arrived 20 minutes early with her documentation organized into 3 separate binders, and Ranger at her heel. The board was 5 people. A colonel named Whitfield, who had been in the Army for 26 years and had the bearing of someone who considered sentiment an operational liability. A civilian veterinary consultant named Dr. Sandra Park, who had published extensively on working dog welfare and whose published positions were, Ava had determined through careful research, considerably more progressive than her current institutional role suggested. A JAG officer named Captain Reese. A representative from the Department of Defense Contracting Office. And Doyle, who sat at the end of the table with the expression of a man who had initiated a process he was no longer entirely sure about. Whitfield opened. Petty Officer Carter, you've submitted a proposal to acquire 14 active MWD transition cases under a private non-profit arrangement. Summarize your position. These dogs are not transition cases, Ava said. They're veterans. The military calls them military working dogs when it needs them and transition cases when it doesn't. I'm asking the board to consider what we owe to one category before we default to the language of the other. Whitfield looked at her over his reading glasses. That's a philosophical opening. Give me a practical one. 14 dogs. Average service duration, 6 years. Combined operational deployments represent 42 years of active military service. Their work includes explosive detection, patrol, tracking, and handler protection in active combat zones. She opened Binder 1 to page 1. 3 of them have confirmed saves, documented instances where their detection directly prevented casualties. 7 have behavioral flags that the facility has categorized as placement barriers. My position is that those behavioral flags are not indicative of permanent dysfunction. They are indicators of trauma that has not been addressed with appropriate protocol, and they are therefore not justification for euthanasia or indefinite institutionalization. You use the word euthanasia, Reese said. One of the 14 dogs has a 60-day welfare flag in his file. At the current rate of behavioral decline, he will be assessed for euthanasia within that window. She looked at Reese directly. I use the word because the file uses the word, and I think everyone in this room should be using it instead of the word managed. A brief silence. Dr. Park had been reading the binder since Ava opened it and had not looked up yet. She turned a page with the focused efficiency of someone who was reading faster than the conversation and had been doing so since the beginning. Your proposed facility, Park said without looking up. Montana location. How many acres? 240. 40 enclosed, 200 open range. The enclosed portion includes individual kennels, a training facility, a veterinary treatment area, and a communal socialization space. The open range is for behavioral therapy through graduated exposure. controlled environments that allow the dogs to move in open terrain without the overstimulation of civilian public spaces. Park looked up for the first time. Who designed the behavioral rehabilitation protocol? Dr. Elaine Mercer, 15 years in trauma-affected working dog rehabilitation, former consultant to the Marine Corps MWD program. Her full credentials and methodology are in Section 3. Park turned to Section 3. Whitfield had been watching Ava throughout this exchange with the specific attention of someone revising an assessment. He had come into the room with a position. She was too young, too junior, too emotionally invested to have built something that would actually work. And the position was developing structural problems. The funding, he said. Walk me through the sustainability. Initial capitalization is covered by existing commitments. Page 9 has the breakdown by source. Ongoing operational costs project against 3 revenue streams: foundation grants, individual donors, and a portion of the facility's income from a service dog training program that will operate alongside the retirement sanctuary. Working dogs from the sanctuary who demonstrate aptitude and temperament will be trained as PTSD service animals and placed with veterans through a VA partnership we are currently negotiating. She paused. The dogs help fund their own facility by helping the people they served beside. Something moved around the table. Not dramatic, just the specific quality of a room that has been presented with something it didn't expect and is adjusting. The DoD contracting representative, a man named Folsom, who had not spoken yet, looked up from his papers. The VA partnership. Where does that stand formally? Letter of intent signed. Full partnership agreement under review. Projected finalization in 60 days. She held his gaze. Which is within the window of the current facility's welfare timeline for 3 of the 14 dogs. Folsom looked at Whitfield. Whitfield looked at his binder. Ava waited. She had learned patience from the same curriculum that had taught her everything else, from environments where moving before the moment was right cost more than waiting. She could wait. She was very good at waiting. It was Doyle who introduced the complication. There is a procedural issue, he said. He said it with the careful voice of a man delivering information he knows is going to be unwelcome. Section 4 of the MWD Transition Protocol requires that any bulk acquisition, defined as 4 or more dogs from a single facility in a single transaction, be subject to a secondary review by the Office of the Secretary of the Army. Ava had known this. She had known it for 4 months. She had been preparing for it for 4 months. Yes, she said. Doyle blinked. You're aware, I contacted the Secretary of the Army's office 6 weeks ago. The correspondence is in Binder 2, Section 4, page 22. She looked at the board. I wanted the secondary review requested proactively rather than triggered defensively. The office assigned a liaison officer named Major Torres. She has reviewed the documentation and submitted a preliminary recommendation to this board this morning. Ava looked at Whitfield. Did you receive it? A pause. Whitfield looked at his assistant, who was standing against the wall with a tablet. The assistant nodded once. Whitfield picked up his phone, spent 60 seconds reading something. His expression during those 60 seconds was something Ava watched carefully. The specific micro-movements of a man reading a document that is telling him something his position requires him to absorb without visibly reacting. He set the phone down. Major Torres recommends approval with conditions, he said. The room exhaled, not loudly, but collectively. The kind of exhale that happens when a tension that has been building finds a release point. What conditions? Dr. Park asked. Quarterly welfare reporting to the MWD Oversight Office. Facility inspection rights retained by the DoD. Handler contact facilitation. Any former handler who requests contact with their former canine must be accommodated within the sanctuary's framework. He looked at Ava. Do those conditions present any problem? No, she said. They're already in our operational framework. Pages 16 through 19. He looked at her for a long moment. The twist came without warning. Folsom, who had returned to his papers during the exchange about the secondary review, looked up. There's a problem with Dog 7, he said. Everyone looked at him. Kilo, the German Shepherd from the Bagram rotation. He turned his paper so Ava could see it across the table. His service record is flagged. There's an ongoing investigation into the unit he served with. The DoD Legal Office has placed a hold on his records, pending resolution. Ava went very still. What kind of investigation? She asked. I'm not at liberty to detail it. But the hold means Kilo cannot be transferred to any non-military entity until the investigation is resolved. How long does the resolution typically take? Folsom looked at his paper. The flag was placed 14 months ago. The room processed that. Kilo had been in the facility for 8 months. The investigation had begun 6 months before he even arrived. He had been transferred into a facility with an active legal hold on his records, which meant the behavioral flags, the placement barriers, the notation that he was not responding to standard socialization protocol. None of it had been properly assessed because nobody had been able to access his full history. Because his history was locked inside a 14-month-old investigation. Who is the investigating authority? Ava asked. JAG, Folsom said. Ava looked at Reese, the JAG officer on the review board. Reese looked at her, then looked at his hands. I'm not connected to that investigation, he said. I'm not suggesting you are, Ava said. I'm asking whether JAG has an expedited review process for holds that are affecting animal welfare. A pause. That's not a standard provision, Reese said. A lot of things I'm asking for today aren't standard provisions, Ava said. Can it be done? Reese looked at Whitfield. Whitfield looked at Reese. Something passed between them in the way communication passes between people who have worked in the same institutional space for long enough that they understand each other's signals. I'll make an inquiry, Reese said. I cannot promise a timeline. I understand, Ava said. I would like Kilo to stay in the facility under enhanced welfare monitoring while the inquiry moves forward. I don't want him to hit his welfare threshold while we're waiting on a paperwork resolution. That would require a welfare hold extension, Doyle said. Yes, Ava said. I know. Another silence. Dr. Park had been taking notes during this entire exchange. She set down her pen. Colonel Whitfield, she said, from a veterinary welfare standpoint, I want to go on record that the enhanced monitoring request for Kilo is medically appropriate. His current documented decline warrants intervention regardless of the legal hold status. Whitfield looked at her. You're recommending the hold extension? I'm recommending that we not allow a dog to deteriorate below a recoverable threshold because of a procedural timeline that has nothing to do with his medical reality, Park said. Yes, I'm recommending the extension. Whitfield wrote something down. The room had been in session for 40 minutes. Ava had come in with 14 cases to argue and had been prepared to fight for each one individually if necessary. What she had not fully prepared for was the possibility that the fight would become something more nuanced than opposition, that the room would be more complex than adversarial, that some of the people in it would be looking for reasons to help her, that they needed her to give them. Whitfield looked at the board. I want individual votes on the proposal with Torres's conditions attached. All in favor of approving the bulk transfer with conditions for 13 dogs, pending Kilo's separate JAG resolution. Aye. Aye. A pause that lasted 2 seconds longer than any of the others. Then, aye. Aye. Whitfield looked at his papers, looked at the room, looked at Ava Carter sitting across the table with her 3 binders and her operational framework and 18 months of her own salary and a German shepherd who had not taken his eyes off the colonel for the last 40 minutes. "Aye," he said. "The proposal passes for 13 dogs. Kilo remains pending. Petty Officer Carter, you will receive written confirmation within 48 hours." Ava breathed, just once, through her nose, controlled and quiet in the way she controlled everything. Ranger stood up. He had been sitting at her left side for the entire session in the perfect stillness of a working dog in a formal environment. Alert, non-intrusive, completely present. Now he stood, and his tail moved twice, and he looked at Ava with those dark, steady eyes. She put her hand on his back without looking down. "Thank you," she said to the board. "All of you." She meant it for different reasons with each of them, and she suspected they knew that. As the board gathered their materials and the room began its transition from formal to dispersal, Doyle approached her. He stopped beside her and looked at the binders she was reorganizing. "Section 7B, he said. "The expedited welfare provision. You cited it in your original documentation." A pause. "Most people don't know that provision exists." "I know," she said. "How did you find it?" She looked at him. "I read everything," she said. "Every protocol, every provision, every subsection of every regulation that touches military working dogs, from acquisition to retirement." She closed the 3rd binder. "Because the system wasn't going to advocate for them. So I needed to know the system better than the system knew itself." He was quiet for a moment. 13 dogs, he said. "Today." 13 today, she agreed. "And Kilo when the hold clears." "And Kilo when the hold clears." He nodded. Then he said something she had not expected from him. "The 47 fines, Titan's record." He kept his voice low. "When I read that file when he first arrived, I thought about it. I thought about it more than I usually think about case files." He stopped. "The system doesn't give us good language for what these dogs are. The protocol calls them assets. The retirement paperwork calls them transitioning personnel." He looked at her. "What do you call them?" "Soldiers," Ava said. "Same as anyone else who went where they were sent, and did what they were asked, and came back changed." She held his gaze. "The only difference is, they can't tell us what it cost them, so we have to pay attention." Doyle looked at her for a long moment. Then he held out his hand. She shook it. Outside, through the facility walls, she could hear the sound she had been hearing since she walked in that morning. The low, continuous sound of 14 animals in steel boxes waiting for something to change. Tomorrow, 13 of those boxes would begin opening. And in Kennel 11, a dog named Titan, who had spent 14 months waiting for someone who was not coming back, would finally begin learning that the waiting was over. Not because the system had decided to care, because one person had decided to make it. The written confirmation arrived 31 hours after the board meeting. Ava read it twice in the parking lot of the facility before she went inside. She sat in her truck with Ranger in the passenger seat and the engine off, and the document on her phone, and she read every word of it carefully. Because she had learned that institutional approval and institutional follow-through were 2 different animals, and the gap between them was where things died. The language was precise. 13 dogs, conditions attached, transfer to be completed within a 14-day window. She noted the window. 14 days was tight for the logistics she had to coordinate, but she had planned for tight, and the team she had built over 18 months of evenings and weekends had been on standby for the call that had just arrived. She made 4 calls from the parking lot before she went inside. Dr. Elaine Mercer in Montana, the behavioral specialist, who said, "Finally," before Ava finished the first sentence and immediately began talking transport protocols and intake assessment sequences. The veterinary team lead at the sanctuary, a former military vet tech named Carlos, who had been handling the ranch's animal welfare systems for 3 months in anticipation of exactly this moment. Her legal contact, who had filed the nonprofit paperwork, and who needed to be notified of the formal transfer authorization for liability documentation. And a woman named Patricia Webb in Sacramento, who was Sergeant Marcus Webb's sister, and who had been part of Ava's planning for 6 months under the specific and private arrangement that Ava had not yet told the facility about. Patricia Webb picked up on the second ring. "It's approved," Ava said. A silence. Then a sound that was not quite a word, something older than language, the particular exhale of a person who has been holding tension on behalf of a grief they can't fully resolve, and has just been handed one small piece of resolution. "Titan is coming home," Patricia said. "He's coming to Montana. He's coming to people who understand what he needs." Ava kept her voice level and warm at the same time. "I want to talk to you about something when the transport is settled. About whether you and your family would want to visit. About what that might do for him." "He'd remember us?" "He'd remember the scent. The research is clear on that. Dogs who served with handlers for multiple years retain olfactory memory for family members indefinitely." She paused. "He's been waiting for someone who smells like Marcus." "You smell like Marcus." Patricia was quiet for a long moment. "He's been in that facility for 14 months. "Yes." "And nobody called us." "No," Ava said. "Nobody called you. I'm calling you now." Another silence. "What do we do?" "Nothing yet. Let me get him transferred. Let him stabilize with Dr. Mercer's team. And then we'll talk about a visit." A pause. "Patricia, he's going to be okay. That's not a promise I make lightly. But I've watched him respond to Ranger. I've watched him respond to me. And what I see is a dog who has not given up. He's just been waiting in the wrong place." "Thank you," Patricia said. Her voice was steady and full at the same time. "I don't know why you're doing this. You didn't have to." "I did," Ava said. "I'll call you when he's on the way." She went inside. The next 2 days were logistical and relentless. Transport arrangements for 13 dogs, health certificates, behavioral preparation, vehicle coordination, crating specifications, rest stops, veterinary sign-offs on fitness to travel. Every dog required an individual assessment before departure. Dr. Park, the board's veterinary consultant, had offered to conduct the departure assessments personally, which Ava had accepted immediately, and which Doyle had facilitated without being asked, which told her something about the version of him that existed underneath the one he presented to the room during bureaucratic proceedings. The morning of the transfer, Ava arrived at 5:15. The facility was quiet in the way that large spaces with animals are quiet at 5 in the morning. Not silent, just resting. Low sounds, the particular ambient quality of beings that are not fully asleep and not fully awake, in the suspended state that comes before the day organizes itself into demands. She walked the row alone. Ranger moved with her, kennel to kennel, doing the same careful nose-to-nose rounds he had been doing since the first day. She stopped at each one. Duke, the patrol dog with the healed wrong leg. He was awake, watching her from the front of the kennel. She crouched. "This is the last morning," she told him. She said it quietly and without drama, in the specific cadence she used with dogs that she had learned from Mercer. Not baby talk, not commands, just the steady rhythm of a human voice making sound that the animal's nervous system could orient around. "Today you go somewhere different." Duke's tail moved. Once. Ghost, the Malinois, was pacing when she reached him. He stopped when she crouched. His nose worked the air rapidly, reading her the way he always read her now. Not strangers, not threat, but specifically her. "Today," she said, the same way she had said it to Duke. He sat down. She stopped last at Kennel 11. Titan was standing at the front of the kennel. He had been standing there for what felt like a long time by the look of him. Not the defeated, backward-facing stillness of the early days, but the forward-facing, ears-up attention of a dog who had been waiting for something that he had decided was real. Ava crouched in front of him. She put her hand through the bars. He pressed his nose into her palm and held it there with his eyes closed, and she stayed completely still and let him have that for as long as he needed it. Ranger came and sat beside her. The three of them stayed like that for a moment that nobody was counting. Then she stood up, looked at the kennel door, and said, "Let's go, Titan." The first cage opened at 8:17 in the morning. It was Duke's, the patrol dog, Kennel 1. Doyle's junior officer, Kowalski, was the one who opened it, and Ava had noticed that he had arrived this morning without being asked and had positioned himself at the first kennel without waiting for direction. Duke walked out slowly. He stood on the open floor and turned his head in a full, careful circle, reading the space, assessing whether the new information matched the old categories he had been living inside. It didn't. The old categories were kennel and not kennel, constrained and less constrained. This was something else. This was open, and the open extended beyond the facility in a direction that his body understood before his brain fully processed it. His tail began moving. Not the single, measured movement he had been making for months. This was different. The full, sweeping movement of an animal whose body was expressing something its situation had not previously permitted. Kowalski watched it happen and said nothing. His jaw was tight, and he was not looking at Ava, and he was clearly doing what people do when something hits them in a place they were not prepared for, and they need a moment before they can manage their expression. The second cage was Ghost. Ghost came out fast, not panicked, but with the compressed energy of a high-drive dog who had been running the same three-step circuit for months, and whose body was already reorganizing itself around the fact of actual space. He moved in a rapid, expanding circle, nose to the ground, taking inventory of everything that was now available to his senses. Dr. Park was documenting. She had a clipboard, and she was writing things down with the careful hand of a professional maintaining objectivity. And she was not entirely succeeding, and Ava appreciated both the attempt and the failure. They opened the cages one by one down the row. Each dog was different. Some came out slowly, with the careful, tentative movement of animals that had learned to expect reversals and were not yet fully committed to believing that this one was real. Some pressed immediately against Ava's legs, as if physical contact with the person who had changed things was the first information they needed. One, a German shepherd named Ace, 4 years of combat tracking, walked directly to Ranger and sat beside him with the decisive air of a dog who had made a decision about his new social structure and was implementing it. Ranger accepted this without drama, the way he accepted most things. The moment that stopped the room happened at Kennel 11. Titan's door opened. He didn't come out immediately. He stood at the threshold, the actual threshold, the place where the kennel floor ended and the facility floor began, and he looked at what was on the other side. The room was as quiet as it had been. Ava was standing 6 feet away. She didn't move toward him. She had learned from Mercer that the most important thing you could offer a traumatized animal in a transition moment was the absence of pressure. The clear communication that the next step was entirely his, that nothing would be taken from him for taking it slowly, that the open space would still be open if he needed another minute. She just stood there, arms at her sides, breathing normally. Titan looked at her. Then he stepped out. One step. Both front paws on the facility floor. He stopped. Looked around with his whole body, not just his head, but that full body assessment that working dogs do when they are reading an environment for the first time. Then he walked to Ava. He walked directly, without hesitation, the way dogs walk when they have made a decision with their whole body rather than just their reactive system. He stopped in front of her and looked up at her with those dark, exhausted, still present eyes. She crouched. He put his head against her chest. She put both hands on him and held him there, and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed to be said. Doyle had been watching from the far end of the row. He was standing with his arms crossed, in the posture of a man maintaining professional composure in a situation that was actively working against it. His jaw was set. His eyes were doing something private that he was not going to discuss. After a moment, he turned away from the scene and walked toward the facility office. Kowalski watched him go. Then he looked at Ava and Titan, and he made no effort whatsoever to manage his expression. The twist came at 9:40. Ava was coordinating the loading sequence. Which dogs went in which transport, in what order, with what protocols, when her phone rang. A number she had saved 3 weeks ago under a name she had been hoping to hear from. Major Torres, the liaison from the Secretary of the Army's office. Petty Officer Carter, I'm calling about the Kilo situation. Ava stepped away from the loading area. Yes, ma'am. The JAG investigation was resolved yesterday. I received the clearance documentation this morning. A pause. The hold on Kilo's records has been lifted. Ava went still. He's cleared for transfer? His records are now fully accessible, and the welfare hold can be converted to a standard transfer authorization. But there's something in those records you need to know before you make decisions about his integration. Torres's voice was careful in the specific way of someone delivering information that has weight attached to it. Kilo was present during an incident in Helmand Province in 2022. 2 soldiers from his unit were killed in a friendly fire incident that triggered the investigation. Kilo was with both soldiers when they died. The loading area continued around Ava, dogs being crated, handlers communicating, the organized movement of a logistics operation executing on schedule. She stood in the middle of it, completely still. He witnessed both deaths, she said, consecutively, within a 4-hour window. Torres paused. The behavioral profile in his file makes more sense now. The records were sealed during the investigation, so the facility never had access to the context. They were assessing behavior without understanding its origin. Ava looked at the facility building where Kilo's kennel was still closed, still holding a dog whose records had been locked for 14 months, behind a legal process that had nothing to do with him, and everything to do with what happened around him. Doctor, Mercer is already briefed on complex trauma presentations, Ava said. I know. I read her credentials when I reviewed your documentation. Torres paused again. Carter, what you've done here, the documentation, the preparation, the patience with the institutional process, I want you to know that's not nothing. I've been in this office for 6 years. People advocate for MWDs occasionally. Nobody has come in with what you came in with. They deserved someone who came in with more, Ava said. A brief pause. The authorization for Kilo will be transmitted to Doyle by noon. You can include him in today's transfer if the logistics allow. The logistics will allow, Ava said. "Thank you, Major." She hung up and walked directly to Doyle's office. He was at his desk when she opened the door. He looked up with the expression of a man who had learned over the past 2 weeks that when Ava Carter appeared in a doorway, something was either resolved or complicated. And the distinction wasn't always immediately obvious. "Kilo's hold has been lifted," she said. He stared at her. "Torres called?" 14 minutes ago." He looked at his desk, then at the window, then back at her. "Today?" "I'd like to add him to the transport. He's been in a kennel 14 months, and he's been without context for all of it. Every day we wait is another day he's carrying something alone that he shouldn't have to carry alone." Doyle looked at her for a long moment. He picked up his desk phone and made a call that took 4 minutes and involved 2 hold periods and 1 transfer. When he hung up, he looked at her. "Noon authorization," he said. "You can have him." Ava exhaled once, through her nose, the same controlled release she used for everything. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," Doyle said. "I delayed this process by 11 days because I was following protocol." "The protocol exists for reasons," she said. "You did your job. The review board did their job. And the outcome was still right." She held his gaze. "That's what a system doing its job looks like. It's slow, it's frustrating, and when it works, it actually holds." He looked at her with the expression of a man being offered a perspective on his own role that he was not certain he deserved and wasn't going to argue with. 14 dogs, he said. 14, she said. Today. She went back to the loading area. At 12:17, Kilo's kennel door opened. He was a German Shepherd, 5 years old, larger than average, with a particular quality of stillness that Ava had learned to identify as the external presentation of an internal landscape that had experienced things language couldn't reach. He came out of the kennel carefully, like a dog who had learned to be careful, and he stopped on the facility floor and looked at the other 12 dogs who were already present in the space, crated and waiting for transport, but present, visible, smelling of themselves and each other and the fact of an imminent transition. He looked at Ranger. Ranger looked back at him with a complete, honest, unhurried attention. Something moved through Kilo's posture. Something small and significant. The dog equivalent of a held breath releasing. He walked toward the transport area. Ava watched him go and felt something that she carried in the same place she carried everything that mattered. Not on the surface, not available for inspection, but present and real and permanent. 14 dogs, 14 service records, 42 collective years of deployments, 47 confirmed explosive finds, hundreds of patrol operations, handler protections and building clears, and things that had no names in any official record because they had happened in places that didn't generate reports. 14 animals who had been processed as assets and were about to be treated as what they actually were. She stood at the facility entrance as the last crate was loaded. The building behind her was quiet in a way it had not been when she arrived. Not the quiet of resignation and waiting, a different quiet. The quiet of an absence that was the right kind. Doyle was beside her. "What happens next?" he asked. And he asked it with the genuine curiosity of a man who had been changed by something that had happened in his building over the past 2 weeks, and was trying to understand what the changed version of himself was supposed to do with that. "They go to Montana," Ava said. "They get assessed, they get the space and the protocol and the time they need. Some of them will recover quickly. Some will take months. Titan will take longer than most, but he'll get there." She looked at the loaded transport. "And in a few months, I'm going to bring Patricia Webb to meet him, Marcus Webb's sister. And Titan is going to know that someone from his handler's life is still here, still present, still claiming him." She paused. and that's going to matter more than anything else in his recovery. Doyle was quiet. "Carter," he said after a moment. She looked at him. "The 3 incoming dogs, next month." He met her eyes. "I'm going to flag them for enhanced welfare monitoring from INTIC, rather than waiting for a threshold event." It was the sentence of a man who had shifted. Not dramatically, not with fanfare. Just the quiet internal shift of someone who had absorbed something real and was now applying it going forward. "That matters," she said. "I know," he said. "That's why I'm doing it." The transport pulled out of the facility at 12:49. Ava followed in her truck, Ranger in the passenger seat. The road north opening in front of them under a sky that was doing nothing dramatic, just being there, solid and continuous. The ordinary sky above an ordinary state highway on a Thursday afternoon that was not ordinary at all. She had 14 dogs behind her. She had a facility in Montana waiting. She had the beginning of something that had started as one sentence in a room full of people who didn't believe she meant it. She had meant it. She always meant it. That was, in the end, the only thing that had ever made the difference. The transport arrived in Montana at 11:40 the following morning. Dr. Elaine Mercer was already there when the truck pulled through the gate. She had driven up the night before and spent the hours before dawn walking every inch of the facility with her clipboard and her 40 years of experience, and the specific, focused energy of a woman who had been waiting for this particular morning since a Navy SEAL had called her 18 months ago and described a plan that should have been impossible, and wasn't. She stood in the intake yard when the first crate came off the truck and said nothing for a moment. Just looked. Then she said, "They're thinner than I expected." "They're better than they were a month ago," Ava said. "That's the bar we're starting from." Mercer looked at the second crate coming down. "All right, let's start with behavioral baselines. Individual assessments before any group introduction. We don't put any of them in a space together until I know who they are." "Ghost needs the most careful management first," Ava said. "High drive, severe understimulation, 14 months of no appropriate outlet." I read the files. Mercer was already moving toward the first crate. All of them. Twice. She crouched in front of Duke's crate and looked through the grate without opening it. "Hey, Duke. Long drive." Duke's nose pressed against the grate. "Good," Mercer said quietly. "That's good. Orienting towards stimulus. Responsive." She made a note, moved to the next crate. Carlos, the vet tech lead, had 3 staff members moving with quiet efficiency through the intake protocol. Health checks, hydration, temperature readings, the preliminary medical inventory that preceded any behavioral work. He was former Army, 2 tours, and he had the specific quality of someone who moved through controlled chaos with the competence of a person who had been trained in considerably less controlled versions of it. Ava watched the intake process from the edge of the yard and let her team work. This was something she had learned. When you built the right people into the right roles, the most important thing you could do was stop filling space they were qualified to occupy. She had spent 18 months building this. It was built. Let it run. Ranger stood beside her. He was watching the crates with the alert, interested attention of a dog who understood that something significant was happening and was deciding what his role in it was. She put her hand on his back. "You brought them here," she told him. Not metaphorically. She believed it, in the particular way she believed things that were true but couldn't be fully documented. He had gone kennel to kennel in that facility and touched his nose through bars and communicated something that she didn't have language for, but that the other dogs had understood completely. He had been the first message they received that said, "This is different." This one is real. She believed animals understood more than humans credited them for, and she had stopped apologizing for that belief in any room she was in. The first morning intake took 4 hours. By midday, 11 of the 13 dogs had been assessed, documented, and settled into individual transition spaces. Not kennels, not crates, but the open, fenced individual areas that the sanctuary's design had built around the understanding that privacy and safety were not the same thing, and that animals recovering from institutional stress needed both simultaneously. Ghost had been the most complex. He had come out of his crate at a run, circular, high energy, reading every inch of the intake yard with his nose and his body at the same time. And Mercer had watched him do it without intervening, just tracking him with her clipboard, letting him run until his nervous system found its own edge and slowed. It took 11 minutes. When Ghost finally stopped, he was at the far corner of the intake yard. He stood there panting and looked back at Mercer. She crouched down. "Done?" she asked. He walked toward her. "Good dog," she said, and meant it entirely. The twist came in the early afternoon. Ava was reviewing the first intake reports in the main building when Carlos knocked on the office doorframe. His expression was the carefully managed expression of someone who has information that needs delivery and is thinking about how to deliver it. "Titan's blood work came back from the preliminary panel," he said. She looked up. "What did it show?" "His cortisol levels are consistent with chronic stress presentation. That's expected." He paused. "There's also an indicator for early-stage kidney function issue. Not acute, manageable, but it's been developing and going untreated." He held her gaze. "The facility's medical records don't show any blood panels in the last 9 months." Ava was very still.
"He hasn't had blood work in 9 months," she said. "No." She looked at the intake report in her hands. Then she set it down with the specific, deliberate care of someone managing an emotion by controlling the physical action surrounding it. "How treatable is the kidney issue?" "Dietary management and targeted supplementation. Dr. Park can consult remotely. It's not irreversible." He paused. "We caught it. That's what matters right now." "It matters that we caught it," she said. "It also matters that it was allowed to develop for 9 months without anyone running a blood panel on a dog in institutional care." "Yes," Carlos said. "Both things are true." She sat with that for a moment. Then she picked up her phone and sent an email to Major Torres with the blood work documentation attached and one sentence. "For your records, and for the oversight of the 3 dogs incoming to the facility next month." She sent a copy to Doyle. She was not going to let the anger make decisions, but she was not going to absorb the information quietly either, because quiet absorption was how things stayed wrong. She sent the emails and went back to Titan. He was in the transition space adjacent to the main building, which she had arranged specifically because she wanted him to have proximity to human activity during the initial adjustment period. Mercer's protocol for grief response dogs included gradual reintegration into normalized patterns, the sounds and rhythms of daily life, creating an ambient structure that could, over time, begin to replace the absence of the person the dog was orienting around. He was lying down when she got there, not the collapsed forward-facing exhaustion of the early facility days. This was different. This was a dog lying down in an open space with room around him, in a position that was chosen rather than defaulted to. He raised his head when he heard her. She sat on the ground beside him, not performing anything, just sitting. He put his head in her lap. She stayed there for 20 minutes while the Montana afternoon moved around them. Wind in the grass, the distant sound of other dogs beginning to orient to their new environments. Carlos calling something to a staff member across the yard. The ordinary, ongoing business of a place that was becoming what it was supposed to be. Patricia Webb arrived 3 weeks later. Ava had called her the day after the transfer, and they had spoken for 40 minutes about what a visit would look like, what the research said, what Mercer recommended in terms of timing and approach. Mercer had said 6 weeks minimum before family contact. The dog needed to establish basic environmental security before introducing a stimulus that carried the emotional weight of the handler's scent. Ava had pushed for 4 weeks based on Titan's rate of stabilization. Mercer had looked at the behavioral logs and agreed to 3.5. Patricia drove up from Sacramento with her mother, Marcus's mother, and her daughter, who was 9 years old and had her father's eyes in the photograph Ava had in the file, and which she had looked at more than once over the past months. They arrived on a Wednesday afternoon, which was a deliberate choice, midweek, midday, when the ranch had its quietest rhythm and the dogs were in their most settled state. Ava met them at the gate. Patricia was 41, tall, with the careful composure of a woman who had been managing grief for 2 years and had developed expertise in the management of it. She shook Ava's hand and looked at the facility around her with eyes that were doing a lot at once. "How is he?" she asked. "Stabilizing," Ava said. "He's eating. His kidney situation is under treatment and responding well. He started engaging with the other dogs in the communal yard. Not deeply yet, but present." She held Patricia's gaze. "He's not the dog your brother's file describes yet. But there are glimpses. Dr. Mercer says that's what recovery looks like at this stage. Glimpses. And then the glimpses start staying longer." Patricia nodded. "Can we see him?" "That's why you're here." Mercer was with Titan in the transition yard. She stepped back when Ava brought the Webb family through the gate, positioning herself at the periphery, present for observation, absent from the center of the moment. Titan was standing. He had been lying down when they arrived. Something had registered before they opened the gate. Patricia said later that they hadn't said anything, hadn't made a sound, but Titan had stood up while they were still 40 feet away. The olfactory memory. Exactly what the research described. Patricia's mother made a sound when she saw him. Small, involuntary. The sound of a woman who had lost a son and was now looking at the dog who had served beside that son and who carried in his biology a version of the person she had been grieving. Patricia walked forward slowly. Titan watched her. His body was reading her the way working dogs read everything. Complete, accurate, without the filters that human perception applies. He was reading the biochemistry of her grief and her love, and the specific molecular signature of a family that had been his family's family. And it was landing in him the way the research said it would, but that no research could fully prepare you for watching. He took one step toward her, then another. Patricia crouched. She put her hand out and she said one word, barely audible. "Titan." He walked to her and pressed his whole head against her chest, and she put both arms around him and closed her eyes, and the Montana afternoon went completely quiet around all of them. 9-year-old Lily, Marcus's daughter, watched this from beside her grandmother. Then she looked at Ava. "Does he know about my dad?" she asked. Ava crouched down to her level. "He knows your dad isn't coming back," she said. "He doesn't understand why, but he knows the people standing in front of him are part of the same family. He can feel that." She paused. "And I think that helps him understand that your dad mattered, that the people who loved him are still here." Lily looked at Titan. Then she walked forward and sat on the ground beside her aunt and Titan, and the big dog turned his head and looked at her, and then, slowly, leaned against her, the way dogs lean against people they have decided to trust. Lily put her hand on his back. Ava stood back and let it be what it was. In the weeks that followed, the Ranger K9 Veterans Ranch became something that had started as documentation and planning and phone calls at 2 in the morning, and had become, through the specific alchemy of a person who refused to stop, a place that was real. Duke's leg was reassessed by a specialist, and a corrective protocol was established. He would never run the way he had run in the field. He ran in the way that was available to him, which was enough. Ghost was enrolled in an intensive daily activity program under Mercer's direct supervision. By the end of the third week, he was no longer pacing. He was working, not in the field, but in the structured training program that channeled his drive into something with direction and purpose. He became, within 2 months, one of the dogs Mercer used for demonstration work with new arrivals. High-drive animals responding to a high-drive dog. Kowalski had given Ava his contact information on the morning of the transfer. She had followed through. Beau, the Belgian Malinois who had served with his unit in Kandahar, had been adopted by a retired police officer in Nevada in 2021. He was alive. He was healthy. He had a yard and a person and a life that fit what he needed. Ava sent Kowalski the adoption records with a single line. "He made it. He's okay." Kowalski replied 4 hours later. "I didn't realize I needed to know that. Thank you." Kilo's recovery was the longest. What Mercer described as a complex dual grief presentation, 2 losses, proximate in time, compounded, required the careful, unhurried work of a specialist who understood that some things could not be accelerated without breaking what they were trying to build. Kilo did not have family to visit. His unit had been decommissioned. There was no Patricia Webb waiting to drive up from Sacramento. What he had was the ranch. He had the open space and the daily protocol, and Carlos, who had quietly made Kilo his personal project in the way that people attach themselves to the most difficult cases, because something in the difficulty resonates with something in themselves. Carlos had 2 tours and his own version of what it meant to witness things you couldn't process and keep functioning anyway. He understood Kilo, not because of the research, but because of the territory. By the 3rd month, Kilo was eating full meals. By the 4th month, he was participating in the communal yard sessions that Mercer ran 3 times weekly. By the 5th month, he did something that made Mercer stop writing and simply watch. He walked up to Titan in the yard and stood beside him. Titan looked at him. The 2 dogs assessed each other with a specific, unhurried attention of animals that had both been through things that didn't translate, and were recognizing that quality in each other. Then Titan sat down. Kilo sat beside him. They stayed like that for 20 minutes. 2 dogs who had each lost everything that made the world make sense, sitting in a Montana yard in the afternoon sun, not alone. Mercer wrote in her notes, "Self-initiated peer support. Both dogs demonstrating secure attachment to location and community. Milestone." Then she closed her notebook and went to find something to do that would allow her to be briefly and privately overwhelmed without anyone documenting it. Ava was in her office when the article ran. She had not given the interview. She had been asked, twice, by 2 different journalists who had picked up the story through the nonprofit's public filings and the MWD advocacy community that had been amplifying what the ranch was doing since the first transfer. She had declined both times because the story was not about her, and she was not going to make it about her. She had suggested they interview Mercer instead, and Mercer had given an interview that was careful and specific and entirely focused on the dogs and what their recovery looked like and what the research said about what they needed. And the article that ran had a photograph of Titan in the open field, head up, ears forward, the tan and gold and black coat catching the afternoon light, and a caption that read, "A dog who served 6 years in combat finds peace." The piece was shared 200,000 times in the first 48 hours. The donations that came in over the following week were enough to fund the full year of operating costs for the sanctuary. Ava looked at the donation reports and felt nothing that needed to be performed about it. Just the quiet, solid satisfaction of a structure she had built, holding the weight it was designed to hold. She called Doyle. He picked up on the third ring. "I saw the article," he said, without preamble. "I wanted to let you know the 3 dogs coming to you next month," she said. "I've already sent the intake documentation to your office. If the behavioral flags look similar to what we saw with the 14, particularly any signs of grief response or understimulation, you have my direct number." A pause. "Carter." "Yes, sir. The enhanced monitoring I said I was going to implement for incoming dogs." Another pause. "I also went back through the files of the dogs that were euthanized in the last 3 years, before you arrived. 6 cases. I had Dr. Park do a retrospective assessment on the behavioral documentation." His voice was careful and deliberate. "She believes 4 of those 6 cases were grief response presentations that could have been addressed with appropriate protocol." The office was very quiet. "4, Ava said. "Yes." She held that. She held it without letting it collapse into the anger it deserved, because the anger was not useful in this conversation, and Doyle was not calling her to be prosecuted. He was calling her because something had changed in him, and he was doing what changed people do. "What did you do with that assessment?" she asked. "I filed it with the MWD Oversight Office. I requested a full protocol review, and I contacted the families of all 6 handlers." His voice carried the particular weight of a man who has done a hard thing and is not looking for credit for it. "I didn't know what to say to them. I said the truth." Ava breathed. "That was the right thing," she said. "It was a long time overdue," he said. "That's not the same thing." "No," she agreed, "but it's not nothing either." The conversation ended, and she sat in her office for a while with the door open and the sound of the ranch around her. Mercer's voice in the training yard, Carlos calling to a staff member, the particular chorus of dogs in open space that was nothing like the sound she had heard when she first walked into the Colorado facility. That sound had been resignation. This sound was something else. She went outside. Ranger was waiting for her at the office door, the way he always waited, without anxiety, without impatience, just present. The way he had been present since the beginning. The way he had gone kennel to kennel in a Colorado facility and communicated something to 14 traumatized animals in a language that preceded and superseded everything Ava had put into the documentation and the binders and the 18 months of phone calls. He had been the message before she had words for it. She walked out into the open field, and he walked beside her, and the afternoon was completely ordinary and entirely full of what it had taken to build. Titan was in the field. He was running, not the tight, anxious circles of an animal in distress, but the open, reaching run of a body that had remembered what it was made for and was using it. His tan and gold coat caught the light, and he was, in that moment, exactly what the file card had described and what the facility had not been able to see. A soldier, running free, in a field that existed because one person had looked at a row of cages and refused to accept the language of inevitability. Ranger ran with him. 2 dogs in a Montana field, uncontained, unbounded, fully themselves. Ava watched them and thought about a sentence she had said in a room full of people who didn't believe she meant it. She had meant every word. She had always meant every word. And the dogs who had protected soldiers in places that didn't appear on public maps were home at last. Not because the system found a way to bring them there, but because a 22-year-old woman with 3 binders and 18 months of her own salary decided that someone had to. They had protected us in war. She had protected them in peace. And that promise, once made, had never once been negotiable.